In September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, thus starting the Second World War. As a result of this conquest, it annexed large chunks of land in that country, and one chunk of land it annexed was renamed the Warthegau region, after the river Warthe, which flows through it. The policy of the National Socialist regime was to Germanise this territory, and to do that they needed to get rid of the Polish and Jewish population. Initially, this was done by deporting these people further east. Later, as far as the Jewish population was concerned, it was by mass murder. Some 380,000 Jews lived in the Warthegau in 1939. Very approximately, around one half of them were murdered in this village, Chełmno nad Nerem, renamed Kulmhof by the occupiers. The machinery of death required very few people, and the Nazis came to Chełmno with the experience they had gained in killing the mentally and physically sick in Germany and in occupied Poland. However, the procedure of mass killing required some assistance for tasks such as digging the graves and searching the bodies for valuables. These tasks were given to what was called Sonderkommandos. The Sonderkommandos were prisoners, although the status of the non-Jewish Sonderkommando at Chełmno nad Nerem was very unusual, inasmuch as they were at liberty to leave the camp and visit people in surrounding villages, and were treated by the Germans almost as equals. Some members of the Sonderkommando at Chełmno nad Nerem became part of the Nazi apparatus of death, and one of those people was Henryk Mania. Henryk Mania was the first Pole convicted by a Polish court for committing National Socialist era crimes. This is the story of how a youth ended up being part of the Sonderkommando in a National Socialist death camp, and then spent a significant part of his life attempting to justify what he did there. In this video I shall describe the crimes of the Nazi regime that affected the life of Henryk Mania, and show you what these places look like today. Henryk Mania was born on the 17th of January 1923 in Rakonowice, which was then very close to the German border with Poland. He did basic schooling and then became a roofer's assistant. In 1939 he was apprenticed to a baker. Living close to the border, his village was occupied at the beginning of the invasion. In the second week of September 1939, a patrol appeared in his village. It came to him and demanded some coffee to drink. When he made it for them, they accused him of trying to poison them. Maybe it tasted a bit odd, or maybe this was just an excuse, but he was arrested. Perhaps because of his age, he was only 16, they chose not to kill him, although of course the Nazis did not shrink from murdering children as well. The fate of Henryk Mania was to be arrested and sent to a camp at Wolsztyn, some 5 kilometers to the west of Rakonowice. Here he had to carry out repairs to roads and railway infrastructure. After a while, alongside a group of prisoners from Wolsztyn, he was sent to Fort 7 in Poznan. Fort 7 was originally part of the 19th century Prussian fortification system that surrounded the city of Poznan. It was secured by a deep ditch and high rampart, and was also reinforced by an iron fence and wire barriers, so it made a suitable prison. As a concentration camp, it was set up on the 10th of October 1939, initially under the command of SS Untersturmführer Herbert Lange, who was later to become the commandant of the death camp at Chełmno nad Nerem. Fort 7 was primarily intended as a transit camp for the thousands of people who were being arrested in the newly annexed territory. However, Fort 7 was also an execution site where probably between 10 and 15,000 people perished. Only 479 victims are known by name. Sometime in mid-October 1939, test gassings were carried out in Fort 7 on an unknown number of people. This was done in a makeshift gas chamber which had an iron door, which was, at least initially, without a seal. August Becker from the Security Police Forensic Institute was probably present. He was to supervise the test gassings at the Nazi killing centre in Brandenburg in January 1940. The Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler attended a gassing murder as an observer on the 12th or 13th of December 1939. The murders were carried out using carbon monoxide gas discharged from steel cylinders from IG Farben's Ludwigshafen plant. It's estimated that up to 400 mentally ill people were gassed with carbon monoxide at Fort 7 in Poznan. When Henryk Mania was sent to Fort 7, he was assigned to the Sonderkommando, whose task was to bring prisoners to the location where they were to be gassed, loading the victims' bodies onto trucks, and then digging mass graves and burying the dead in the surrounding forests. He would have done the same for those prisoners murdered by other means also. As part of Action T4, the murder of the physically and mentally challenged, Sonderkommando Lange murdered the patients in various hospitals and care facilities in the Warthegau, such as Dziecianka, Kościan, Gostynin, Kochanówka, Nerem and Warthe. The group of Polish gravediggers at Lange's disposal consisted of 13 people, although 8 of them, including Mania, were those most often taken by the SS to killing operations outside Poznan. At the turn of May 1940 and June 1940, Sonderkommando Lange was sent to the transit camp in Działdowo. The SS men then murdered 1,558 patients from psychiatric hospitals in East Prussia. Mania and 12 others buried the bodies. Then Sonderkommando Lange suspended his activities for almost a year, and the Polish gravediggers were again imprisoned in Fort 7. After some time, possibly in the late spring of 1941, Lange sought out those gravediggers who had previously been in his commando. He noticed with disaffection their poor physical condition and ordered them to be provided with additional food, explaining that they needed to regain their strength before their new task. In June 1941, the reactivated Sonderkommando Lange resumed murdering mentally ill people in the Warthegau. Mania and his group were again forced to work as gravediggers. In the summer of 1941, the T4 killings were officially stopped, although they did continue at a much slower pace, and this time in secret. A large part of the staff of the T4 murders were transferred to what was to be called the final solution of the Jewish question. To this end, the Sonderkommando was moved to Konin in Poland. In the autumn of 1941, in the forest between Niesluch and Rudzice, and then in the Wygoda forest near Kazimierz Biskupi, its members murdered Jews from ghettos in the Konin district, experimenting with various methods of mass murder. At the end of October, they were sent to Kalisz, where they murdered the residents of a Jewish retirement home. During these actions, Mania and his companions were digging mass graves, burying the victims' bodies, and searching their clothes for valuables. When the Nazis decided to kill all the Jews in the Warthegau region, they opened a killing centre at Chełmno nad Nerem. Here, on the edge of a village, was a manor house with a granary which had been abandoned. It was taken over by the SS, who had a high fence placed around the outside, and a mobile gassing vehicle was brought in. This was to be the responsibility of Sonderkommando Lange, including Henryk Mania, who was brought here to help dispose of the bodies in the late autumn of 1941. On the 8th of December 1941, Jews from the nearby town of Koło were brought here to be murdered. Mania was accommodated with 7 other people on the ground floor of the ruined palace. The others were Lech Jaskolski, Marian Liebelt, Henryk Malichak, Franciszek Piekarski, Stanisław Polubinski, Kajtan Skrzypczynski, and Stanisław Szymanski. Their first task was to erect a fence around the building and build a wooden ramp. This was mainly done by Malichak and Szymanski, while Mania and the 5 others worked on digging mass graves in the Rzeszów forest. The SS men nicknamed Mania Heinrich the Younger, as opposed to Heinrich the Elder, Henryk Malichak. Victims were brought here initially by lorry and later by train using the narrow gauge railway between Koło and Dąbie. Inside the courtyard of the manor house, they were welcomed by one of the SS dressed up to look like the lord of the manor, who told the victims that they were going to work on his land. They were led to an upstairs room which was heated, and where they were asked to disrobe for disinfection. Then they were led down to the basement to a ramp into the gassing vehicle. Usually the first victims went voluntarily. Those at the end had to be forced in through the use of whips. The doors were then closed. The vehicle drove a few meters away to a spot where the exhaust was fitted to direct the gas inside. An additive or a toxic chemical was probably added to the fuel mix. The engine was started and thus the exhaust fumes were pumped inside the vehicle. After around 20 minutes or so, the exhaust was disconnected from the rear and the lorry was driven to the Rzeszów forest where the victims were buried. It was common for some people still to be alive. These people were finished off with firearms by the SS. The bodies of the victims were initially buried, but by the spring of 1942, they were burned. When the mass extermination of Jews began in the camp, Mania's main task was to collect money and valuables that the victims had put into an alleged deposit, and then to issue them with receipts. He also took the victims to the basement of the palace, and if they resisted, he and 3 of his companions pushed them into the mobile gas chambers. He often used a whip. After the war, he described the transport of Czech children from the village of Lidice, brought to the camp to be killed. When 6 Jews escaped from the camp on the night of the 15th to the 16th of May 1942, Mania and the other Polish prisoners took part in the hunt for the escapees. They were not recaptured. He claimed that he was a translator at the time. Although 8 Poles were still formally prisoners, in practice they had already acquired a status similar to that of unskilled workers, the so-called Hilfsarbeiter, the help workers. The SS men even allowed them to wear civilian clothes, and they could move relatively freely in the surrounding villages where they maintained social relationships with local people. Sometimes the Germans even took them out to meals and restaurants. They did not receive money for their work, but they did get regular rations of vodka. They were also in a position to take money and valuables belonging to Jews, which they secretly stole from the Germans. According to the post-war testimony of one of the SS men, they were also allowed to sexually abuse young Jewish women taken from the transports on several occasions. Henryk Mania was at the Chełmno death camp until the 7th of January 1943. At this time he was accidentally shot in the leg by a drunken SS man. He was taken to the hospital in Koło, from where, after completing treatment, he was sent back to Fort 7 in Poznan. In 1942, Sonderkommando 1005 was formed with the objective of digging up the bodies of Nazi mass murderers and destroying them so that no trace would remain. I have done a separate video on this and there's a link below. One of the first locations where the bodies were dug up to be burned was at Chełmno nad Nerem, and this happened when Mania was there. However, there were mass killing sites all over Nazi-occupied Europe. A decision was made to destroy the corpses of these crimes in the Warthegau. In November 1943, together with 3 comrades from the death camp at Chełmno nad Nerem, Lech Jaskolski, Henryk Malichak and Kajtan Skrzypczynski, he was assigned to Sonderkommando Legat, also known as Wetterkommando. It was a special SS unit that covered up the traces of crimes committed by the Nazis in the Warthegau. The task of Mania and the other Poles was to supervise about 50 Jewish prisoners who carried out work related to the exhumation and the burning of the corpses. In addition, they helped find mass graves, which in most cases they had dug themselves in 1940 to 1941. The Sonderkommando finished its work in the spring of 1944. The Jewish prisoners were then shot, while Mania and the other 3 Poles were sent back to Fort 7, from where they were later taken to a camp at Żabikowo. On the 23rd of June 1944, Mania was transported from Żabikowo to Auschwitz, where he received the camp number 189229. On the 4th of July 1944, he was transferred to Mauthausen in Austria. There he received camp number 78441. After 5 days he was transferred to one of the sub-camps, Linz 3, where he was liberated by American troops at the very end of the war. He was one of only 4 Polish prisoners from the Chełmno death camp who managed to survive the war. In part 2, we shall examine the post-war fate of Henryk Mania.